This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. The stories of the Mohegan Tribe date way back to days before the land we live on was known as Connecticut. The Mohegan people have shared this rich history with each generation through the tradition of oral storytelling. Stories can often capture a deeper and fuller understanding of a people and their worldview than historical texts. Today, we'll hear from one of the tribe's culture bearers, someone tasked with keeping the traditions and beliefs of the Mohegan people alive. Melissa Tantaquidgeon Zobel is part of a long line of women to be culture bearers. She's also vice chair of the Council of Elders and tribal historian for the Mohegan Nation. Melissa, thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Good morning. It's great to be with you too, Kat. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, we're very excited to have this conversation. And just a quick note for our listeners that if you have questions for Melissa, if you have stories you want to share with us, give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So Melissa, we're talking about a tribe, the Mohegan Tribe, that has a very long history here in Connecticut. Can you tell me where in the state the Mohegans call home?
Sure. The Mohegans live in southeastern Connecticut, and we're based in a town that is called Uncasville. That's where our reservation is, and it's named after Sachem Uncas, who was our chief in the 1600s. We don't typically name places after people. That is a European custom, but we're still all very proud to be from Uncasville.
That's so interesting, with that differentiation, and there's a meaning with Uncasville, right? Can you tell us what does it mean? Because the Mohegan people are known as wolf people, and I believe that's related.
Yes, it is. So Mohegan actually means wolf people, and Uncas comes from Wonkus, which means fox, or Wonks, which means fox. So much of what you'll hear in terms of our stories and our traditions relates to plants and animals, and people are constantly being reminded that they're perhaps not quite as important as the rest of creation.
And we're going to get into that, I think, throughout the conversation this hour, and talking about the long history in the 1600s. The Mohegan tribe was unique, sort of in the sense that they decided to cooperate or maybe even become friends with the English. What do we know about why the Mohegan tribe made that decision at that time?
You know, it's interesting. It's a great debate, isn't it? Why leaders at any time make the exact decisions they make. So
Sure.
I can't speak for Uncas, but we were a very small people in the 1600s. We're still a very small people. And we saw more and more, specifically English people, coming by the boatload every day. And really, I think we realized that this was a group that wasn't just passing through. These were people with whom we would have to learn to live and cooperate, and people that we would need to learn to understand. And the most important thing, obviously, was trying to see how they thought and what they believed. And that was a very, very difficult task because, as you'll find out, I guess, as we go on, our language and our culture is so vastly different from European culture. But you know, friendship is friendship, and Uncas made a good decision to not just ally, but actually make personal friends with certain English people, Samuel Rogers being a great example. Friends with whom you can joke around, friends with whom you can have fun, not just have political alliances. And I think all of our chiefs since then have given that personal touch to our relationships.
And because of that sense of friendship between Mohegan tribe and the English for a while, I'm sure that really provided a different kind of experience and perhaps even influenced storytelling. But there was a time, and over time, Indigenous children experienced backlash for using their Indigenous languages in schools, right? So can you tell me more about how that came about and perhaps the fight to preserve the language during those times? And we're going to get into how you're doing that in the present day too.
Well, my aunt Gladys Tantaquidgeon, who was our late great medicine woman, used to say there were a lot of misunderstandings. Isn't that the source of just about every conflict in the world? One of the misunderstandings is about leadership, for instance, among our people. Men and women both led, and that sometimes went against the grain of colonial leaders, because women were not allowed really to have positions in leadership in colonial New England. There are exceptions, of course, but it was rare. And our language was a problem because it spoke about spirits and beliefs that were very, very different. Everything was connected, and plants, animals, and people had equal value. And of course, that's something that is debated in many cultures as to how much we value different things. And so that, I think, made the language seem so alien that it was really frightening to people. And that language was under attack in the sense that we weren't allowed to speak it in schools. And once you hit the 1800s and definitely the 1900s. And so it was only really thanks to one woman, Fidelia Fielding, her name was Jitspodanashor, which means flying bird, who decided to keep diaries in the language and pass down some of it, that we have enough to restore it now in the 21st century.
Wow. I mean, I've shared this before. I mean, I don't know how it would feel if anyone come in and read my diaries. It would not be that exciting or fascinating or interesting, but I love learning about history through diaries, especially if it's a personal one, because it's from the person versus sort of a literary fiction or nonfiction that was created specifically for people to read. And you mentioned Flying Bird, so she had her diaries. Can you talk about sort of the story behind that? How were those discovered, and how much do we know about her life? Because she experienced the language suppression firsthand.
She did. She was beaten for speaking the language in school. So she didn't really like school, and she left school. But
understandable.
Right. But she was, her diaries aren't what you would think of as typically Western diaries,
sure,
in the sense that she's not talking about, I was embarrassed to school today, or I met a cute boy. She's not talking about those things in her youthful diaries. She's talking about the river and the birds and the weather and all the things around her and the changes of the seasons. And so what's really reflected in her diary is a philosophy of life and a way of seeing the world. And that's very special, because that's at the heart of any language. And that's something that you sometimes have to understand first in the case of our language before you can get into kind of the nitty gritty.
And as you go through her diaries, were there, I mean, I imagine the entire experience is probably pretty magical and exciting, but was there anything about it that jumped out to you that, big differences or actually similarities maybe?
Yeah, so she talks a lot about giving thanks. And she specifically gives thanks when things are the worst. And that's a magnificent lesson. So if she says, I don't have enough to eat today, but I know somebody's coming by tomorrow. When do we go? Thank you to the Creator. Or my house may be leaking, but I have a roof over my head and some don't. So I give thanks. And it's, the idea of giving thanks more the less there is to be thankful for, kind of a theme in all of her work. So she's really a great philosopher in many ways, and a spiritual guide, I would say. In terms of her diaries and what happened to them, the story is almost unbelievable. Her diaries were written in the early 1900s, and an anthropologist asked to borrow them. An anthropologist from Columbia University had wanted to look at them. And so this man, J.D. Prince, had a house fire, and the diaries burned.
Oh, no.
The last words in the language, everything burned. And so this was a terrible bit of news for the tribe, and the tribe was horrified. And so during the Spanish flu pandemic, which was a few years later, her son was stuck in the house, and he was complaining that he was stuck in the house and he was quarantined and he didn't know what to do with his time. And we all know what that feels like.
Yes.
So he finally went through his mother's stuff and found more diaries.
Wow.
Which was wonderful, except the diaries went into academia again. And the Mohegan people were finally able to have them returned during the COVID pandemic, when
so many circles here.
Yes, so many circles, right? When our chief, Matawi Matahash Lynn Malerba, spoke to the leadership at Cornell University, and they very kindly returned them to us. It was a very emotional thing because we felt like they brought Fidelia home.
Mm. And have you had a chance to explore those diaries since then?
Oh, yes. And we have looked at them, and Cornell had them online, and they are available for people to read online. And the translations are tricky because her language was quite broken by the time she was speaking it, right? But they are something that we had a display at our museum. In fact, Tantaquidgeon Museum on her for a while, and many of her belongings are on display there as well if people are interested in learning more about her. And I can talk about her for days, so I won't continue.
Well, it sounds like I can do that too, actually. There's so much I think about Flying Bird that we can really take note and learn from. And we really want to get into the language here too. And I know we need about 5 days just to go through this, but what are some of the ways that the Mohegan language differs from English?
Now, first of all, let me state that I'm not a linguist, and I beg forgiveness from all the linguists out there if I misrepresent anything. But one of the ways in which it's most definitively different is that rather than genders of male and female, we have the animate and the inanimate. And many things are animate that might not be animate in English, and things are all kind of referred to as an it. So people and plants and animals are sort of on the same level. And if you look at things that way and you refer to one another in a kind of an equal way, men, women, plants, animals, and people, doesn't that change the way we see the world?
Yeah.
And I think that's the one most significant, thing about our language, and why right now it feels so timely to our youth. Because it is another way of speaking and acknowledging and seeing that feels healthy for our planet. And of course, that's a matter of everyone's concern.
Do you have an example maybe of what that looks like?
Sure. So if you had like a bug in your hair or something, if somebody would be in your hair, it would be in your hair, just like you'd speak to, a person. It's not going to be any different.
Right. Okay. So it's somebody in my hair versus there's something in my hair.
Or something like that.
Right.
You're referring to it in a much more personal way. And I also think that the other thing is that places are often named after not people, but an environmental function, like the way the place where the salmon run, or Connecticut, of course, the land of the long tidal river, which is important to know, or other places like that, that rivers will be named for maybe a wild river that has a lot of rapids, like the Yantuck. So much of what's around you is the focus of your words and your thoughts.
It's always so interesting to see how different language structure. And earlier you mentioned Gladys, and also I believe Flying Bird's mentee was Gladys, and then Gladys was your own mentor. So that's a long lineage here. Can you talk about those relationships and did Flying Bird teach Gladys the Mohegan language, or was she worried that she would get Gladys in trouble? What was that like?
All of those things, yes. So Gladys was my mentor, and I wrote a biography of Gladys called Medicine Trail, which was one of my first books. And in it, I kind of trace not just Gladys, but Gladys as part of the whole history of the Mohegan Tribe. We're all very much connected, and no individuals are without their connections to the whole tribal story. And so we often say, into the moment comes a Mohegan is an expression we use. And that's because we feel that people come when they're needed and their skills come when they're needed. And so the Delia's skills obviously came when they were needed. Gladys's came when they were needed. And Gladys's mentorship of Flying Bird was only when she was very, very young, because she died when Gladys was 9 years old. And Gladys was already 60 by the time I was born, but she lived to be 106.
Wow.
So there was a longer period. And Flying Bird, lived to be very old, also to her late 90s. So all of these women, including Flying Bird's own teacher,
Mm-hmm.
Martha Uncas, who also lived to be very old in her 90s. So if you go back one more generation, Flying Bird's teacher was Martha Uncas, who was born before America was a country in 1769. And so really just this, there are many Mohegans who carry on traditions. Obviously, this is not a singular line,
Mm-hmm.
but you could just look at a few people and get the idea of how quickly the traditions were passed on through people with longevity.
And can you talk about that relationship too? Are you aware when Gladys was being taught the language or the culture, was there any pushback, not necessarily from Gladys, but just from the environment that Gladys was in?
So Fidelia refused to teach Gladys the language because she said she didn't see her beaten. So Gladys only knew what she caught in hearing the elders speak, a few words when they weren't necessarily paying attention, or just everyday greetings and that sort of thing. And so she later worked on the language as an anthropologist at UPenn. And so she studied the language there with Frank Speck, and she also studied even more deeply our folklore and traditions and recorded them. And so that was her contribution. And then, of course, she helped co-found our museum. So all these were ways, I guess, of preserving our culture and our stories, even in a time when the language had kind of gone silent.
Well, silent no more. I think we're keeping this conversation going. This hour, we're exploring the Mohegan Tribe's history and language with Melissa Tantaquidgeon Zobel, and she's also the vice chair of the Council of Elders and tribal historian for the Mohegan Nation. And coming up, we'll continue to dive into their longstanding tradition of storytelling. And a reminder to our listeners that if you have a question for Melissa, if you have a story to share, give us a call, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Not all history can be learned through textbooks. The Mohegan Tribe, located here in Connecticut, knows that very well. Mohegan people have a long-standing tradition of passing their beliefs, practices, and culture down through the generations by telling stories. This oral tradition is one that our guests' ancestors have been engaged in for centuries. I'm joined this hour by Melissa Tantaquidgeon Zobel, Vice Chair of the Council of Elders and Tribal Historian for the Mohegan Nation. And Melissa, I feel like we're sort of part of an oral tradition today, considering we're having a conversation on live radio about storytelling. And I thought it was really interesting to learn that in every generation, is there one person chosen to carry on the legacies and stories of the Mohegan Tribe?
Well, that used to be the tradition because our numbers had gotten small. The culture was really in dire straits for a long time. But now our tribe works very, very actively. The Council of Elders, the Tribal Council, too. We have a language department with people who are, learning to speak the language. And we have a cultural department, and we have, a curriculum department. And so we have an archaeology department, we have archives, we have library, we have a museum, we have all of these things where we have camp for kids. So it's a fully fleshed out cultural experience for the youth in education. And we still do storytelling. We still have wonderful storytellers like Sister Betty Jean Coderre and Sharon Maynard and others who are great storytellers. But we do spend a lot of time finding other ways to educate. And if teachers are interested in curriculum, please go to the Mohegan website. We have curriculum materials available. We are working with the other tribes in the state on a state native curriculum, which is available soon. And we also have media. We've done a short film on Flying Bird, and there's a play about Flying Bird. There are some short radio plays that are available. And there are a few other tribal films that are available. So we try and create many opportunities, and again, that's all under education on the tribal website, for people to access this information because we know it's hard to acquire this information.
Well, and I imagine the reason why it's so hard is because this was not what it looked like during those times, or back in starting from 1600s up to today. There's a long period of time where that was not the case. So, can you talk about, what were those contributions to now? There's sort of this very, very strong need to preserve and protect the language.
Right. So the 1600s obviously was very tough because you had a clash of cultures, and traditional education didn't mean schools for Mohegan. It meant that, young people men would go into the woods, learn hunting and fishing. Women would learn certain types of fishing too. They also were farmers, the women. They would grow corn, beans, and squash. Everyone had traditional roles. And those traditional roles were different than European roles, right? Women as farmers was different, right? And we didn't do livestock. We did hunting. So there were so many ways in which we were different. And our traditional ways depended on certain types of land and certain access to the land, which was going away. And so the 1600s was really a time of crisis and loss. And the 1700s was very tricky because it was at that point that the United States government really became a government, right? It was just a bunch of colonists kind of not really sure where everything was going. And when you get to the time of the American Revolution, once again, the Mohegans are fighting with the colonists, but it was really tricky to figure out, the English were also our friends, remember? Right. And so we had a leader named Samson Occam, who was a Native American minister, and also an incredible philosopher and educator. He's the person who helped raise the money to found Dartmouth College because it was founded as an Indian school. And so he's this really visionary person. He was a famous writer. So he made friends in England, going to England, raising money to found Dartmouth College. And he was given this enormous sum of money by, the king and the Earl of Dartmouth. And then he came home and everybody said, no, we're not friends with them anymore. It's time for a revolution. So those have been interesting hurdles to try and make it through. So that was also a time when the state of Connecticut said, oh, and I'm sorry, you can't have women leaders anymore. So these were big challenges for the tribes. The 1700s was rough. And then in the 1800s, I think things got worse in many ways because our men couldn't do any of their traditional tasks anymore to make money. And so they all went whaling. And not all, but a large enough percentage that saying they all went whaling isn't that big. So when you go whaling for a very long time. So the women were really the ones in charge of running things because men were away for years, sometimes at a time. And the reason they became whalers, and we know this thanks to Jason Mancini, and head of the Humanities Council and his wonderful work, is that whalers and people of color made the same wages as other people. Everyone was equal on the whaling ship in the sense of, what job you did, you were paid for at a fair wage. At least that's what I hear. And so you would go for that because you could support your family. And that lasted, during a lot of the 1800s. And then in the 1900s, everybody's coming home and we're trying to piece everything back together. And the state after 1769 had not allowed us to have sachems that we elected ourselves. So we had chiefs, then we had head people, and we were trying to bring everything back, the language, the land. And the 1900s was a period of rebuilding. We founded a museum in 1931, and that was a good start. And then in the end of the 20th century, we received federal recognition. So that was an even better start. And that's how we got to where we are today.
Well, I mean, here in the studio, we're still kind of whirling with the idea of how Dartmouth was started. So we're going to have to go and dig into the research after this conversation. And you're talking about women in leadership positions. I think it's very top of mind all the time, and I think we're still sort of in this era that it's a big deal when we see that. But historically speaking, that doesn't seem to be a very new thing for the Mohegan people. So historically, has the keeper of the tribe stories always been a woman, or what was that like?
Well, it's hard to analyze this because, as I said with whaling,
right?
If you have generations where the men are away, first of all, men were away a lot hunting, then men were away a lot whaling, and so it may very well be that it's been mostly women, but they're the ones who are home and teaching the youth.
Sure.
And so it would naturally tend to be them. Now you do have you do have a possibility anybody can pass on stories. It's a little different, and anybody can be chief again, and anybody can be, you have more, and we're not just looking at men and women, we're looking at many genders, and so we're in a big time of flux, I think, and a good time of flux.
Right, absolutely. And coming down towards or going through this flux, take us back a little bit in the beginning. How were you personally taught about the history of the Mohegan people? Were you always connected to it? Were you always fascinated? Because I always like coming into this. I don't want to assume that because you're of a certain person of a certain community that automatically means you're interested, because that's often not the case, right? But how did it start for you?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said interested. I was always interested. And if you're interested, your elders are going to teach you things, right? Because you're interested.
Right.
That's the first test, right? Interested, and also accepting of beliefs that aren't mainstream. You need to be open to that, because you can't pass them on if you really don't fully understand them or appreciate them. So I became involved with tribal tradition because I spent a lot of time with my Aunt Gladys Tantaquidgeon and my Uncle Harold Tantaquidgeon at Tantaquidgeon Museum. Tantaquidgeon Museum, for viewers who don't know, is the oldest Native American owned and operated museum in America. And that's where I grew up. So from the tiniest age, I gave tours and listened and also taught groups of visitors. It was a wonderful place to grow up in Uncasville, because Uncasville is kind of a small town in a remote area, but people from all over the world came to the museum. So I felt so blessed in meeting people from other countries and learning about other languages. And we had this great custom at the museum. It's my favorite museum custom, that my Uncle Harold had been all over the world as a soldier. So he tried to greet every visitor in their own language.
Wow.
And taught us to do the same. And it was a sign of the kind of respect we wish we'd been given for our own language, I think, but also just to make people feel at home, right, and to know that they're welcome. And I think that was a great lesson. So that's the environment that I was brought into the traditions with. I studied it in school. I studied, history and anthropology. I studied government. And then when I was an adult, I was on tribal council in my 20s. So I was very involved from a young age.
I can't imagine growing up in that space. That sounds like such a fun time. Like all the history and storytelling that you've absorbed, probably without you knowing. And I remember hearing from someone. I wish I can remember who the person was, but I was very young when I heard someone say that it's a respect to another person's culture or history when you're in a different country. You don't have to be fluent. I think it might be asking a little too much to be fluent in all of the languages, even though that's a superpower I wish I had. But you're right. It's like, I think, hearing your own native language, regardless where you're from, I feel like especially if you haven't heard it for a while, suddenly hearing that can be very comforting. And is that something that you've experienced too, or is that something that you're hearing, or maybe even feedback from people who visit the museum, hearing perhaps a language that they didn't expect to hear?
Right, and I think it's such a cultural value now that it's something that's at our casino too. There's a lot of cultural activity that's international there, and we've had many of our chairmen have spoken different languages, and we'll connect with different languages and people of different languages. It's something that really, it's just as you say, it's a reflection of respect and a love of global, humanity, but it's also a respect. And respect is at the forefront of our Mohegan values.
And as you were always interested, and you've gotten more interested and got more information from all of your elders. Do you remember the moment Gladys sort of tapped you as her mentee? Like, was it a specific moment, or was it just kind of gradual or an unspoken expectation?
No, she really tapped me a bunch of times.
Okay. Multiple taps. All right.
I remember one time she said to me, well, many times when we're picking our successor, we skip a generation, and you would be that person. And it didn't seem that unnatural at the time, because, as I said, I was so involved with her.
Right.
But I do also remember when, this is a terrible story, she was 98 years old. She went up the hill to the museum. and she slipped and fell and hurt herself. Didn't do anything terrible. Of course, she didn't break anything because, it seemed like she was indestructible, but
Right.
she hurt herself. And she said, well, you and the young people have to take over now. That's it.
That was the moment.
And so she stopped working full time at 98.
Wow. That's amazing.
But Gladys wasn't a dramatic person, and she wasn't she liked to ask more questions than she gave answers. And so there was no like formal selection of any sort. And also, like I said, nowadays, so many young people are selected for so many things. We have fire keepers and pipe carriers and lodge keepers and chiefs and sagamores and nanas and then we have youth groups and they have people they select. And so that process was part of a culture that was really in dire straits. I think the old process. Now, our young people are fortunate to have a more fully fleshed out culture that they can participate in.
That's such a great point. Like sort of like it's kind of a joke, but not a joke. But you walked so they can run, type of thing. And you have children of your own. You have 3 children. They're adults now, and very much building on what you just shared. How important was it, or is it, for you to teach them the customs and traditions of the Mohegan people?
Well, it's not easy to have parents that do that.
Yeah.
My middle daughter Madeline wrote a play that she toured internationally with, where she talks about what her mother did to her to make her learn all these things. So I don't know where to begin with that, but it's hard to carry that responsibility. I think what tends to happen is it's a responsibility, and you don't want to put a burden on young people. But if they're gifted and if they're interested, and if you're part of a culture that needs them, it's hard not to tap them for things. So I teach many, many youth other than my own children, and I've become a mentor to other Mohegan youth far beyond my own children. And so do all of our elders mentor many Mohegan youth, and so do all of our counselors and government people. And of course, our chief is not only a mentor in the Indian way, but because, as we may know or not, but our chief is currently Treasurer of the United States. So she's really a role model to all our young people in the idea that you can succeed in the tribal world and the outside world.
And are you seeing an interest from young people? I don't want to use resurgence, because I'm assuming like there's always interest in some way, because I see that in my own community as well. But are you seeing more younger people wanting to know more?
Yes, absolutely. There's a comfort level with it. There's always going to be maybe some reaction by some to some of the stories because they're odd, they're strange. And that's where it gets hard, right? That's where you separate those who are really, really, really going to put their whole into it from those who are kind of just going to be regular with it. And yet they take the hard path. Some of the young people now, it's really astounding. I never cease to be impressed with how hard most of our young people do work at absorbing their culture.
When I imagine too, with the information exposure we have today versus maybe when you and I were growing up, the resources are so different now, that they can learn on their own and alongside their elders. And I think that's a very, very beautiful thing, the two sort of coming together. And in the spirit of storytelling, I have the best worst question for you next is, do you have a favorite Mohegan Tribe story that you would like to share, or not, or not your favorite, actually?
Wow, this is so hard because of course,
it's like asking anyone their favorite authors, or
I know. Yes. So let me think. So we have some stories that are like a series of stories. And the Chanamede stories are one of those series of stories. So it's a story that takes you through someone's fall and why they fell, right? And it begins with them, and I won't go through the whole story, but it begins with them kind of cheating and stealing and doing little bad things. And eventually they decide they're going to harm a Mohegan woman. And of course, the Mohegan woman is trying to figure out how she's going to defend herself, because the famous thing about Chanamede is that he's so large and so strong. And so ultimately, she winds up having to escape from this man, and she canoes away from him on an island where he's been staying with her. And she's canoeing away, and he gets in a canoe and he follows her. And of course, he's stronger, so he catches up.
Mm.
And so the first thing she does is she throws her mortars and pestles into the water, and they multiply and they block his way because she has some sort of supernatural spiritual aid that comes to her help. And she tries again to get ahead, and she can't. And she has some eggs in her canoe, and so she throws them out. And those not only stop him, but he has to kind of paw through them, and they're messy and they make him madder, unfortunately. So she's afraid that he's going to harm her, and he gets very close. And so she pulls a hair out of her head, a long black hair, and she holds it straight until it turns into an arrow and then a long spear. And she throws it as he's about to capture her, and he's about to harm her with a club, and she's afraid he's going to kill her. She pulls that spear out, and he disappears and falls away. And the end of the story is she was a Mohegan woman, and she survived. So it's the idea that you could survive anything. And the idea of surviving anything, even an impossible situation where, a monster is essentially chasing you, is a reassuring thing at times.
Right.
And so that's why that's my favorite story.
No, that was beautiful. And the moment you were describing the hair turning into an arrow, I can literally picture it in my head and getting chills. And I think that's why we turn to stories, right? Ultimately, we want a little hope, it's possible to achieve the impossible, as our ancestors have taught us. You've been listening to Melissa Tantaquidgeon Zobel, Vice Chair of the Council of Elders and Tribal Historian for the Mohegan Nation. Coming up, we'll discuss the Mohegan Tribe today and what can we all learn from their beliefs about Earth and its many living things. You can join the conversation and hear more storytelling. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. The Mohegan Tribe has long been on a journey to reclaim and preserve their language, artifacts, and land. So what does that look like today? To help us dive into that question, I'm joined by Melissa Tantaquidgeon Zobel, who's the Vice Chair of the Council of Elders and Tribal Historian for the Mohegan Nation. An amazing storyteller, because I'm still kind of coming off of a story she shared in the last segment. So I would highly encourage, if you've missed it, go back and re-listen to it, because my skin is still sort of crawling with feelings in the best way possible. And Melissa, want to sort of pivot a little bit here. We've had conversations here talking about artifacts that were taken away from different tribes throughout the nation and throughout the years. And a lot of important artifacts were also taken from the Mohegan Tribe. Can you talk about why repatriation efforts are so important, and is it still ongoing for the Mohegan people?
Well, yes, thank you. I'd love to talk about that. There is a federal law called the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, through which some artifacts are returned, but others can sometimes be returned through negotiations with museums and other institutions who feel that an item is of high value to a tribal nation for the reclamation of culture. That was the case with the Diaries of a Flying Bird from Cornell. That was the case with the Samson Occam papers from Dartmouth. But what's interesting about those returns that some people may not realize is we believe that objects are imbued with the spirit of their creator. And so those things to us were just like having those people come home and be with us and be close to us again, and to be able to touch them and feel their spirit. This has happened regarding many artifacts, including bowls that belong to Sachemungkus, our great 1600s leader, that have been returned from Leffingwell Inn and Slater Museum and Yale Peabody. And I can't thank enough or say enough good about the institutions when they decide to do this, because the gift this is to the tribe is almost unimaginable. The joy it brings, the fulfillment it brings, and in some cases, the return of ceremonies when the objects are ceremonial, and some ceremonies couldn't be practiced without some of these ancient objects. So I just, it's a great topic for Indigenous Peoples Day, because I think we've come a long way in this country in terms of cooperation and collaboration between museum communities and Native American peoples. And I just hope it keeps continuing. And I thank all those who participated in this process.
Well, and earlier in the conversation, you mentioned the difference. One of the major differences between the Mohegan language and the English language is animate versus inanimate references in words. And here I see that circle coming back, where you're also talking about what we call artifacts, but these are also, they're not just things, they have life. Does that change the way that you or the Mohegan people view these objects? Because I feel like that's another big difference.
It is. And people, I think, probably feel that to various degrees.
Sure.
How much they incorporate that into their belief system. Because I worked around artifacts all my life at the museum, I'm very tuned into that. I find that to be very, very, very important. Some artifacts are given more life by the ceremonies and things that they have participated in. And I don't know if anyone remembers, there was a TV show called Warehouse 13.
Oh my God, yes.
It was about this very topic of how, ancient objects that were used for important things or by important people at important events carried a life of their own. And this is something that I think has come through many societies. It's kind of been downplayed in recent centuries, but it's a pretty old belief, I think.
And with the life and the stories that go behind the artifacts, here's another hard question for you. Are there any specific artifacts that have been returned recently that you're particularly excited or happy about?
Oh, there's so many. I guess, the idea of the papers was a surprise. Both the Samson-Occam papers and the Fidelia Fielding papers. And the thing especially about the Samson-Occam papers was that when something is readily available, you spend more time with it. And so we work with Dartmouth College on many things related to Samson-Occam, but when you bring in scholars, native scholars, non-native scholars, to discuss these things, it keeps them in the forefront of your mind. And I think the work that Samson did, because we've been studying them so much, we realized he wasn't just a man of his time. We realized he was supporting coeducation in the 1700s. He was doing things that perhaps we hadn't really given as much thought to as we should. And so this is probably true of all peoples, not having possession of their own heritage. They then can really start to lose it because they haven't fully been able to, spend time with it, incorporate it. And that, I think, is the value of repatriation.
And I mean, you mentioned earlier you have written several books. You're an accomplished author, and a lot of your books are specifically about the Mohegan people. So for listeners who want to learn more about the history of the tribe and its people, which of your works would you recommend they turn to?
So I'd say Medicine Trail. Medicine Trail is the biography of Gladys Tantaquidgeon. And that's an important story because it's not just Gladys's story. It's really the story of the tribe, because it talks about some of her teachers, one whom I haven't mentioned yet, Emma Baker, who was a medicine woman of the Mohegan Tribe, who actually, her story is fascinating too. She was educated at Yale for a while by the president of Yale's mother, brought her in to be educated. And so she has an interesting tale to tell. And all of that generation of Gladys's generation, there were so many people like Chief Bataga, and there's just person after person of that generation that are really key to Mohegan history, and so they're all in the story, right? And the other thing that it does is it talks about some of these animate and inanimate things. We have a famous rock called Mohegan Rock, which is one of the largest freestanding boulders in New England. And it's called Grandfather Rock. That's what its name means, because it's considered to be an elder. So we're back to animate things. So you can learn a lot from a book like that, I think. For those who want something more accessible, I just have a short film out called Flying Bird's Diary, which isn't released yet. It's only in screenings. It just won the Rotterdam Film Festival, so we're very happy about that. And also I did a play also called Flying Bird's Diary, where we had a reading at Long Wharf Theater. So those are things that are either forthcoming depending on the genre you like. There's a wonderful book called Dawnland Voices that has many Mohegan stories in it by many Mohegans, not just me. And there's a book called Mohegan Chief, which is the story of Harold Tantaquidgeon, which is quite good. If you want a nice comprehensive list, you don't want to have to remember what I said, just go to the Mohegan website, and in the education section, you can look up all the things you want to read about Mohegan.
And we'll certainly have links to that on our website as well for people to check out at ctpublic.org/wherewelive. And we only got a couple minutes left here. When you're having fun, time really flies. Today is Indigenous Peoples Day, as you mentioned earlier, Melissa. What are some of the things that Mohegans believe or practice and that you think the rest of the world could benefit from?
Well, whether we like it or not, we had to learn to collaborate and cooperate. And that was a gift. It's not maybe something that was seen as a gift when it first happened, right? But it was a gift because I guess we have a peculiar perspective on America. We appreciate all the many nations that have come here and what they've contributed, including our own, and including the many tribal nations who have contributed so much. And so without sounding too, Pollyanna about it, it's somewhat of a hopeful perspective despite all that's happened. And I think that we continue to enjoy meeting other people and learning about them. And our very unusual nature makes us want to meet other people with unusual natures. And so I think the thing I'd say for Indigenous Peoples Day to everyone is, wherever you live, learn about the Indigenous peoples, share your stories and your cultures with them. And just be open to something you might not expect.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your stories with us today. You've been listening to Melissa Tantaquidgeon Zobel, who's a vice chair of the Council of Elders and tribal historian for the Mohegan Nation. Melissa, it was amazing having you on today, and thank you so much for being so gracious and sharing your stories with us.
Oh, thank you, Kat, and happy Indigenous Peoples Day to all.
Happy Indigenous Peoples Day to our listeners, and thank you so much for tuning in today. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Chloe Wynn. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app, and thank you so much for listening, and happy reading, everyone.